Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khotlelo Mashish. I'm a candidate scientist at the Department of Water and Sanitation. And today I'll be taking you through the review of the Northern Cape Regional Monitoring Network. In the interest of time, I'll skip over my presentation outline and straight into the introduction. The Department of Water and Sanitation, guided by the National Water Act, Chapter 14 to be specific, is responsible for the establishment of monitoring systems in an attempt to conserve and manage our water resources. And the diagram you see below there is the groundwater monitoring programs that the Department of Water and Sanitation is currently running. And then in terms of groundwater levels, the Department of Water and Sanitation collects and maintains groundwater level data from 9 regional monitoring networks. And these 9 regional monitoring networks are comprised of about 1,927 boreholes, And then in 2016, a review of this national monitoring network was done. However, the monitoring objectives for each individual borehole were not clearly classified. So thus arose a need for a site-specific review of this regional monitoring network to assign monitoring objectives for each individual borehole. This is the methodology that my colleagues came up with when they did the review of the Limpopo Regional Monitoring Network, and it begins as soon as a geosite is identified appropriate for the National Monitoring Network. It is then move on to the next stage, which we assess the site conditions, whether or not it's ambient or developed. Then we confirm any groundwater use within a 5-kilometer radius. Then we assess the groundwater level trends or hydrographs over a 10-year period but this particular study, I did historical because of data availability. And then after that, we classify them whether baseline, which is a geosite that is in ambient conditions with no groundwater use and no fluctuating water level, or trendline station, which is a geosite in a built-up area with groundwater usage and a fluctuating water level. Now, jumping into the review of the Northern Cape. The Northern Cape is in the western part of South Africa, and the monitoring network is comprised of about 64 monitoring boreholes, 41 of which are for groundwater levels, and then 23 of which are for water quality. And then in terms of monitoring purpose, it's split between background monitoring and also monitoring for the impact of pumping. And then if we plot the groundwater usage of this area, we can see that the predominant water usage in this area is agriculture, mining, infrastructure, and then also water supply services. Now, these are the baseline monitoring sites that were identified by the Northern Cape region. It's about 30 baseline monitoring sites, 25 of which have a monitoring purpose of background values, and then 5 of which have the monitoring purpose for monitoring the impact of pumping. And then if we plot the groundwater usage, you can see, I failed to mention, this particular study was only done for the Uppington route, not the entirety of the Northern Cape. And then if we plot the groundwater usage, you can see that most of the baseline sites do not coincide with any groundwater usage. However, there are some sites that coincide with groundwater usage. Now, using the methodology I had outlined before, 12 monitoring sites were identified for verification and further analysis because they did not fit the characteristic of a baseline monitoring site, whether that was due to groundwater usage or the historical hydrograph. And I'll take you into a few of those examples right now. One of them is this monitoring site. It is a baseline monitoring site. However, as it shows here, there are groundwater users in the region. And here, these groundwater users are tapping into the same aquifer, and they're abstracting around about 168,000 cubic meters per year, but this is just maximum registered volumes. If we look at the historical hydrograph, it shows that these groundwater level fluctuations have a correlation with the abstractions. Thus, it does not conform to what we would characterize as a baseline monitoring site. This is another site which does not have any groundwater usage within a 5-kilometer radius. However, if we look at the historical hydrograph, it does show groundwater level fluctuations. Thus, it also needs to be verified and possibly reassigned. Now, this is just a hydrograph of a baseline station that does not have any groundwater usage within a 5-kilometer radius, and as you can see, it's quite stable. Now, moving over to the trend sites, we have approximately 34 trendline monitoring sites, and all 34 are monitoring for the impact of pumping. And then if we plot the groundwater usage again, you can see that majority of them coincide with the groundwater usage. Again, it's agriculture, mining, and water supply. And then these sites, using the methodology, were selected, and then they also do not conform to a trendline monitoring site. Again, whether it's groundwater usage or the groundwater hydrograph. And then this is just an example of that. As you can see, within a 5-kilometer radius, there is groundwater abstractions of about nearly 1 million cubic meters. But if you look at the hydrograph, particularly from the period of 2018 to 2025, the water level has been quite stable. Thus, this might also need to be reassigned. And then from the study, we have learned that characterizing the monitoring network in terms of its monitoring objectives is quite important. And there are specific sites that need to be reevaluated based on their proximity to abstractions or the historical hydrographs. And in terms of the baselines, I said 12 of them. And then in terms of trend line, about 7 of them. Thank you very much. Oh, and then this is the paper that my colleagues did on the overview for more detailed methodology. I also provided a QR code for ease of access. Thank you very much.